Please let the clapping be more to appreciate him accepting to be on this panel for us. And the next person joining Mr. Lanre is Mr. Olagoke Saeed Salawu, who is a leading voice in financial crime compliance and digital era risk governance. He is also the president of the Financial Crime Compliance Department at Sterling Bank, as well as the president of the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists for West African Chapter. Shall we welcome him with a round of applause? Thank you very much. Thank you very much for accepting to be part of this panel.
So to start, I would like us to focus on immediate challenges of this new draft. So the new AML baseline draft represents a significant operational shift. And from your perspective, what is the single most difficult requirement for financial institutions to implement effectively, and what is a practical first step to address it? So I would like us to focus on three main steps, on three main perspective. So in terms of the regulatory perspective, what is the implication? And then in terms of the technical perspective, and how do we solve it?
While I commend the CBN in coming out to this draft, I think the draft, this baseline that they released has been much needed. I think it's a few years too late, in my opinion. I think we should have had this a while ago. Like he rightly said, it's a bit generic. If you look at it, you know, I played in the payment space, I've played in the cross-border space and in banking, widely different requirements. If you look at just transaction screening alone, looking at the baseline, you cannot cut across all three of them. So like he rightly said, I think they have to apply a bit more nuance to it. And one thing I'll just add is the data part as well. If you look at the guideline, what they requires rich, structured, and well-processed data. I'm not sure a lot of financial institutions have that kind of data. So I also believe that they may need to give some allowances. I don't think every financial institution needs to be fully automated yet. If you look at the FATF requirement, they still allow you to do some manual, you know, if you don't have too many customers, you can still do some things manually. So I think that document requires a little bit more structure and more depth.
Okay, thank you. When you look at Africa, there is a lot of countries that have been gray listed, and this has a very heavy impact on FDI, foreign direct investment. I believe that's why the majority of the central banks are currently reviewing their regulation around money laundering, so that they can come off the gray list. So now, in terms of the global context perspective, so based on what I just mentioned, this draft was not implemented in a vacuum. So how was FATF focused on effectiveness to help financial institutions in Nigeria?
I would say I don't want to directly tie the draft to us trying to get off the gray list. It is, I would not say it's not connected as well to what, you know, largely, if you look at the last 4 or 5 years, there have been a number of regulatory advisories and, circulars, maybe more in the last 4 or 5 years than in the last 10 years. Will you say it's tied to us being gray listed? I don't want to be the one to say it. But the point is that I think as a country, we have gotten to the point where we cannot hide our size and our importance. Being gray listed was not a good mark for us. And I will say for a fact that the present government has been making a lot of efforts to get us off the gray list. I cannot say too much on that. You know, we just had the delegates from FATF recently come to do the ICRG. And I hope it's going to be good. Everybody continue to pray for the country. In terms of the document itself, I think it's going to take us to the next level in terms of compliance as a whole. Like I said, the idea, if you look at a number of financial institutions, for example, you can see some people probably don't have transaction monitoring solutions. I mean, there are people who don't do transaction screening. So I believe the goal of this document is to at least get everybody on a standard, which is why it's called the standard baseline, right? Get everybody up to a point where you have at least, basic things. And then my hope is that when everybody gets up to a certain level, then we can then build up to the next level. Whether that will make sure that we don't get off the gray list is a completely different thing. The gray list is there are a number of things. There's the political will, there's the strength of the supervisors, there's the effectiveness, there's the tech. So, that's a bit complicated. But will it help us as a country in terms of our compliance posture? Absolutely, it will.
Okay, thank you for that. Very insightful. Since COVID, a lot of onboarding processes went digital. Okay, so where banks and other financial institutions are heavily invested into digital transformation to facilitate onboarding. So the concept of FREML, which is fraud and AML, requires breaking down historic silos, okay, in terms of modular solutions. So beyond technology, what cultural and procedural shifts are essential to foster true collaboration between fraud, AML, and cybersecurity teams? So maybe we can break it down in terms of technical perspective, people perspective, and processes.
So let me also just, I see that also, you mentioned a lot about the technology. I just want to also drill down a little on the people part of it. So the intersection of fraud and AML. So while generally from a global perspective, there is convergence, I think there is also going to be a need for people to acquire those skills. We need to have more people who are, AML, I think we're having a conversation, and the truth is in a lot of financial institutions, you have siloed departments. You have your AML team here, you have your fraud team here. They probably never speak, maybe on a quarterly basis or something. So from a people perspective, there needs to be more deliberate convergence of professionals, people trying to get that skill and marrying them. And what you will find is that when you have both skills, you realize that they are very, very interwoven. One is a predicate offense, one is a secondary offense. So there must always be money laundering after fraud. So it only makes sense that we have this process flow that works together. So I just wanted to put that in there.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Lagoke. So maybe to move to the next question, this will focus much more on the identity imperatives. So a core challenge is achieving a holistic view of customer identity. So how can institutions effectively blend digital identity intelligence like device reputation, behavioral biometrics, with traditional KYC data to satisfy the new draft stringent due diligence requirement? We are Mr. Lagoke.
Okay, thank you. When I hear these words, I'm always happy because it takes me to somewhere I want us to be. So I know the FATF released the documents about maybe 2 or 3 years ago on digital identity, and they mentioned a particular phrase, progressive identity. So the concept means that when you onboard a customer, the truth is at that point, that is the least you should know about that customer. That's the least you should know about that customer. And the idea is that with every transaction, every time he touches, if he has a mobile app or he has a card, with every point of intersection with your institution, his transactions, his behavior, the way he logs into the app, you should be learning more about that customer. And by 3-4 years' time, ideally, his risk to you should be slightly lower because you should know him so well. You know where he lives, and of course, this is with data protection and data privacy, right? But you should know everything about the customer. So the truth is, I think if we implement a lot of these things, like you mentioned, device reputation, address geolocation, and all these things, we can actually put in place a very, very strong KYC program. I remember the last speaker talking about if you want to mitigate any kind of financial crime risk, it starts with KYC. That's the truth. Money laundering, fraud, sanctions, everything can be resolved with KYC. Strong KYC can mitigate half of those risks. So whether we can get there is another thing. It requires a lot of data, right? Having worked in a place where we had to implement these things is not straightforward. For you to do things like device reputation, it means you have to have access to the device IP. You need to be able to track it. You need to be able to, geolocation. It means you need access, right? I know I was working in a place recently where we were trying to do geolocation, and the truth is, in line with data privacy requirements, you need to tell the customer you're taking their location, right? And if the customer says no, then you can't do it. So there's a lot of intricacies that go into it. But in terms of whether they are required, absolutely. And if there's regulatory backing from the regulators like we have with this draft, and the technology service providers like yourself are able to key in on some of these things, I believe we will then begin to see a very, very steep decline in financial crimes.
Thank you for that. Before I let my panelists go, I would like to thank them. Thank you, my panelists. And we will move to the next one, Diana. Thank you. So, any questions? Other questions here? Maybe we'll direct it to you, Mr. Lagoke. How ready is the Nigerian banking sector in fighting fraud?
Extremely ready. I think the banking sector has been very hit by fraud. And then I think earlier on this year, NIBS came up with a procedure where if you are found to be culpable, they take some money from you. So if you allow fraud pass through you, they just debit you. So the banks are very, very incentivized to curb fraud. In terms of systems, one of the reasons why there is not a lot of structure around fraud is that there is not a lot of regulations or enough, regulatory guidance around how you do it. So what has been happening is different banks have different programs based on their risk appetite. But generally, in terms of fraud risk, the banks are very ready. And I know that with this circular coming out, and then with most of the inflection coming from the fraud and AML convergence, I know that the banks will be implementing a lot of these things very quickly. Like you said, 12 months is short, but I know that a lot of banks already had. Immediately this document came out, they already started working on it, without it being finalized.
Last question for Mr. Olagoke. So with this new baseline standard in Nigeria, what changes should banks expect in exams in 2-3 years, and how can we align transaction monitoring?
So even now, and for the guys in the bank, they probably can testify to this, the type of testing and audit we have gone through has changed just between the last 2-3 years. I think this year's examination was more control-based. It was more risk and control focused. So previously, you would have examinations come in where they are literally very granular, checking for packages and all that. Now what you have is, how frequently do you test your solution? What is the process flow? How many false positives do you have? How are you bringing down that false positive? What is your process for tuning and all that? With the baseline, if you look at the baseline document, it makes a lot of demands on compliance teams and technology teams as well. It's talking about how the solutions must be interoperable, how the data must be clean, how data must be fed. So I see, in 3-4 years' time, the type of oversight and monitoring from the regulators and even from the global, even from your correspondents, to be a bit, less granular, more of how is your system working as a whole, your technology, your people, your processes. And if we come from that perspective, I think we'll be moving away from this checkbox era where we just, people just do things for the sake of it, and it will be more risk-based, more of a risk-based approach, honestly.
Thank you for that. Please, a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you.
This session is going to be quite robust. We're going to look at some of the areas we've not been able to attend to. And so it gives me great delight to invite to the high table or the podium here, the head of the Financial Crimes Compliance Department at Sterling Bank, Mr. Olagoke Sayid Salawu. Please, can you put your hands together for him? You're welcome, sir. I'm not too sure I saw you at the F&I session. You were here at the FCC. Oh, no wonder. You're welcome.
My question to the panel is, how are we seeing Nigerian financial institutions orchestrate and deal with the varying different touch points of information, whether that's BVN data, whether that's NIN data, whether it's broader fraud or consortium data, and how is that best orchestrated so that there's a joined up approach and a good holistic view of the customer being registered?
If you look at what we have, I think as financial institutions, we kind of have a largely laid down process flow for what we need to do. So we have guidelines that have come out. We have the CBN customer due diligence regulation that came out in 2023. We have the PEP management framework. We have the UBO framework. And then we also have the BVN and NIN guideline that came out in 2023 as well. And it kind of tells you what you need to do. You must start with BVN, you must match it with NIN and all that. The point I'm trying to make anyways is that for elementary parts of KYC, it's very clear what needs to be done. However, we have moved past that. We have so many kinds of channels now that we provide services through, and a lot of these things no longer meet that requirement. I was listening to Sam Altman from OpenAI, and he was saying, if you still rely on voice prompts or facial recognition for KYC, then you're in the past, because deepfakes is going to blow you out of the water. So at this point, we need to start rethinking KYC as a whole. How can we make KYC more rudimentary? How can we make KYC foolproof? So I think while we have those processes in place, I think there needs to be a lot of innovation, a lot of intuitiveness in the industry around how we want to do these things. Another thing, for example, is address verification. If I were to throw a question to the House around how does everybody do address verification, I'm sure you hear a lot of different answers. The guys in the banks do physical verification, some guys do geolocation and all that. And really, for example, if you ask the guys who do geolocation, do you understand how that geolocation works? A lot of people probably don't. And it goes down to what you were talking about, the black box effect. I know when you speak to a lot of vendors, explain to me how you do the geolocation, it totally becomes very, very complicated, right? So to make, just to kind of round off, the point is, in terms of KYC as a process, yes, there are steps in Nigeria to guide you around how you must do KYC, but every institution needs to then begin to understand their risks, right? So if you're a fintech and most of your customers are, you acquire your customers digitally, then probably a lot of the guidelines around the regulation might not be sufficient for you. So you have to take that advancement. If you have unique risks, in terms of geographies, for example, then you might want to do something additional. Physical verification, geolocation tracking, and all that. So it's really nuanced. So the processes, the technology built on it.
Next question is for you, Olagoke. So in terms of AI-enabled fraud, do we think that Nigerian banks are prepared for this new wave of attacks and threats, whether that's from deepfakes to automated phishing? We've already heard your thoughts on voice cloning. But yeah, how are banks and how are you responding, and what controls are giving you the most effective impact on that issue?
So whether banks are ready for AI-enabled fraud, we can't say now. The reason why I would say we can't say now is because I can't say for certain that fraudsters here have started adopting those typologies yet, because maybe there is no need to. So fraudsters will always, they will always expend the minimum amount of resources to get the maximum gain. So if they don't need, I think the last panelist mentioned it. Today, the financial landscape is so siloed that you can apply the most minimal techniques, rudimentary techniques. And if it doesn't work here, you can try it in another place because we don't share information. So if somebody attacks my financial institution and for whatever reason the person fails, I will not share it I probably wouldn't share it with the next bank and next, and all that. So what that allows is that the threat vector is very wide, and you can, as a fraudster, you can test different places until you get it. So what that has also done is that it has also made the fraudsters here not try, things that are overly complex, overly difficult. But in the next 4 or 5 years, we will say that. I know there was a video circulating about 6 months ago of some guys who did a deep fake, and they had the Asian person's face, but they couldn't speak like the person, right? But all those things with agentic AI and all these things, all those things are going to be cleared out very soon. So very soon, we'll be able to have agentic AIs that will be fraud. They'll be created with the intent of fraud, right? Digital personas that carry out fraud. And one thing you realize about the Nigerian banking sector is that they react very quickly once money is involved. Once money is involved, they move very nimbly. So I have no doubt that the banking sector will react very quickly. My concern really is around the other players in the financial sector. So today, there are some players that are more exposed to technology-based financial crimes. For example, the PSSPs, the guys who create payment gateways and all that. They have their own unique financial crimes. There is merchant laundering there's transaction laundering. For example, merchant laundering is something that people don't talk about, wherein people literally create fake websites, open shell accounts or shell companies, and then they use that to launder millions and millions and millions of naira and dollars. And we see it in the bank, right? Sometimes you reach out to a particular third-party payment provider and you're like, this person you are facilitating transactions for, who are they? And when you dig a bit deeper, there is nothing there. And that particular TPP has done billions of outflows on behalf of that entity. So I really see more risk to the adjoining financial institutions who are more tech-enabled, and I see a lot of fraud risk there, enabled by some of these things, by deep fakes and all that. In terms of banks, not yet, maybe in the future, but I do know that they will react very, very quickly.
Yeah, I think there's a high possibility that this just accelerates that flywheel for fraud innovation, and accelerates just the pace and volume at which threats come through. So yeah, I fully agree with you, and I think that it's definitely something that we have to keep a close eye on. It's interesting how these things sort of come back circle as well, because what you described sort of touches a little bit on Festus' earlier point around know your customer's business. So why is that pizza shop processing that much money? Why is that flower shop processing the amount of money that maybe should go through a crypto exchange?
And just also, when you said it, something came to my mind around fake passports. I think I was looking online recently and I saw that you can literally tell agentic AI to create a synthetic ID. Full. It will give you like an international passport, a Nigerian international passport with a face looks Nigerian and all that, right? And it goes back to the first question around KYC. So if you have a platform where you do not do validation, for example, which goes back to what Mr. Festus said, and I think on the other panel where we talked about the importance of due diligence, then your system is already beat. If what you call KYC is just looking at documents on the face value, then technology is going to finish you completely. There is nothing around it, right? So that's the importance of where you now need to do the validations, the screening, the checking against independent database. If not, you really be in a world of hurt.
How, with Framil in action, how we can really break down silos and fight fraud back smarter, and whether with threat actors using fraud to hide money laundering and fund money laundering and to exploit your AML blind spots and hide stolen funds. How are we working at different levels to have a unified fraud, AML, risk, and cyber risk response framework?
I think just to lay on what he has said, for Framil to really proliferate Nigeria, for example, I think we need to adopt the fraud risk mentality. So if you look at what COSO is doing, they have introduced the concept that fraud is not just something that happens, it's actually a risk. And what, like any other risk, what you should do is to try to identify it quickly, analyze it, and mitigate it. So when you begin to look at it from that perspective, then fraud actually changes, right? You can begin to, you should be looking more at, and I think Ose mentioned it on the previous panel, we should be looking less at detection, more at prevention. Now, if we look at it from a prevention perspective, you realize that AML and fraud are basically the same thing. And Mr. Festus also mentioned it, the techniques that you use to sort of flag ML, TF, PF is what you use to flag fraud, right? Fraud, data clustering, network analysis, prediction analysis, segmentation, customer segmentation. All these techniques will work on both ML, TF, and fraud. So the real convergence of both of them is one from the understanding perspective. The second thing is for how do you want to treat them and what kind of techniques do you want to use for them. So now circling back to the question, I truly believe that when we have solutions that are equipped to look at both fraud prevention, in terms of, this typology or this particular pattern is wrong, therefore halt this transaction so we can ask questions, it will then feed into higher quality STRs, for example, which is what we do in terms of transaction monitoring, right? Because when you ask those questions, it doesn't make sense. Then you automatically, by stopping transaction, you automatically feed straight into your ML outflow, which is the STR, right? And what will then happen is that you have created an end-to-end flow where you are both mitigating against fraud risk, ML risk, TF, and PF. So I think by time, and if you look at this baseline standard, what is going to do that? This is going to lead to, because a lot of the language there is about interoperability. Having solutions that speak to each other. And where we should eventually land is where you have a system where your transaction monitoring feeds into your KYC real time as transactions are happening. Every time you file an STR, your customer risk rating is increasing automatically. As your customer risk rating is increasing, it's putting back into the transaction monitoring solution that this customer is now higher risk. Higher transaction scrutiny is happening. That's also feeding into your fraud risk solution. Your fraud risk solution is saying this person logged in, into the app at 1 a.m. That is unusual. That is feeding into the customer profile. So there has to be a lot of, dialoguing by these systems. And what would be better if all of them are happening on one platform?
That's a good point, because if you see corporates across the world, they've already solved the problem with SAP and Oracle, right? Because you have ERP systems. Whether you use Salesforce, whether you use any of the own platforms or Workday for HR or something, all of them are connected to a centralized ERP platform. So any change in one of the systems will automatically come, and the data integrity is held across the corporates. It doesn't matter whether a corporate is in Nigeria or Ghana or UK or US, right? But that doesn't happen in financial institutions, because, as you said, I think it was you who mentioned about Chinese walls as well, right? So at some point you need to have Chinese walls, but at some point you also want to gravitate towards a common platform, which is what seems to be missing across financial institutions today. And as a technology service provider, we generally try and connect our own dots. So we have, at a payment level, we have APP fraud solutions. At the behavior sec level, we have behavior sec, and we have transaction monitoring, which connects across financial institutions to say, if a fraudster has opened a account in Zenith Bank and closed the account tomorrow, open the bank again in Axis Bank, then we should be able to identify those kind of patterns. So from a technology perspective, the solutions are there, the industry use cases are there. It's just getting all of them together as a part of a community or a jurisdiction to actually implement that, which is what I think the CBN's AML drive is all about, because it is talking about interoperability, it is talking about efficiency, it is talking about technology-driven AML and KYC, but it fell short at fraud because it didn't talk anything about fraud.
So the next question that we have is about the mobile and digital channels and how we can build layered defenses where they matter the most. So with the explosion in transaction volume for mobile and digital platforms in Nigeria. What layered security controls, whether they be device intelligence, biometric authentication, behavioral monitoring, behavioral biometrics, what are proving the most effective in protecting users and accounts? And
and you mentioned some things that were very interesting for me around, so while we talk about fraud, a lot of times we always assume that, it happens in the dark and is unknown. But like you mentioned, there is the fraud that happens before, where the person has been, rewired, and the person is knowingly doing it, right? Is knowingly doing that transaction. And I think, looking at that, I think I would like to take from what they do in the UK, for example. And I think a few fintech players have started doing it, and I think I would encourage a lot of financial players to do it, which is when you want to send transaction to someone, when you want to send when you want to initiate a transaction to someone you have never sent money to, they include something called risk-based friction. So they will say, you have never sent money to this person before, why? And after it will give you like additional prompts. It might even ask you to do like facial recognition to be sure you are the one. And that concept, risk-based friction, I think is very important. I did some work on it some years ago, and it was a very wonderful concept, right? It's very interesting because, like you mentioned, around obtaining data points around a particular transaction. And what that does is that when you have a solution that picks all the way from when you pick up your phone and you are trying to log into your app, it looks at how many times did you put in the password? What way did you type in the password, right? Is it unusual? The way you imputed the transaction, the way you interacted with the app. And based on certain indices, it introduces friction. So maybe normally what you need to put in place to authenticate the transaction is just your fingerprint. But because you put in the password twice instead of just putting it one time, because you have never logged into your app by that time before, it would introduce maybe 3 authentication levels, right? So it might ask you for your fingerprint, a security ID, and maybe voice, right? And when I saw that, I was like, look, if you have something like this, it's going to minimize device-based fraud significantly, right? The only thing, of course, is that it's friction, right? But it's good friction. That's one thing I wanted to talk about. The second thing I also want to add is compliance by design. Like Festus mentioned, I think the information security guys, they have been able to solve that problem, which was when doing the iteration of the products, they are able to come in at the beginning at the conceptualization level and be in those rooms. I don't think compliance guys are there yet. We are always at the end. So typically they just come to you after they have done the UAT and they're like, oh, sign off. So I think it's the battle we are fighting in the financial ecosystem now. We are trying to do that compliance by design to make sure that from conceptualization we are in those rooms and we are applying those regulations, those laws, and we are also helping them design those applications to make sure that they mitigate all those risks.
Questions on it as well.
My name is Francisca Babatunde-Beke. I work with SID Digital. It's a subsidiary of Secure ID Limited. So my question is, sometime late June, the CBN held a stakeholder section with CEOs and CCOs of payment service providers. And one of the key things that were discussed at that event was that some statistics were rolled out in 2024. They recorded 52 billion lost to fraud. And what was interesting about this is that a significant portion of this could not be traced because they were related to virtual accounts. Because of course, virtual accounts don't have any audit trail. So my confusion or my question in all of this is, how does all of these discussions fit into addressing this as a key business concern? Because you know what CBN told us in that occasion? They said, virtual accounts are alien to regulation, and as it stands right now, we do not acknowledge it. However, in the absence of official maybe notice outrightly prohibiting it, of course, you will not be penalized for using it, but then they are working towards it. Maybe, I don't know if that's going to happen or if there's going to be a prohibition. Now that's on the first part. So the first question is, how does all of these discussions, the tech, fit into addressing that issue? Now my second question is, we've talked a lot about ongoing due diligence, several levels of KYC, and what comes to my mind is, we're in an era where people don't just want things fast, they want it easy. If at every stage in time there's something that looks like a bug, I don't think this demography of persons right now have the kind of patience for that kind of,
That's true.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
true.
So it's going to reduce customer adoption of certain maybe financial technology products, and they're probably going to look for the easier products. And so how do you balance the security for your products and of course not and of course the business end, customer adoption, and not pushing them away? Thank you very much.
KYC customer adoption. We'll take that question. I'm very sure this is the virtual accounts thing is also one of the major concerns. How is it that people operate accounts, funds gets into that, and then all of a sudden you can't? it's like I don't know. So, and I'd like to hear from the banker as well, because Mr. Festus, you've actually ticked up my interest a lot. So, but over to you, Kira, and then we'll respond to that. Perhaps we'll use that to wrap up. But before you go ahead, is there any other question, just in case? Okay, that's just going to be about, and I think that's good enough, 2 in 1. All right, over to you guys.
So, in our earlier discussion before we met today, we actually spoke a little bit about virtual accounts, and Olagoke actually was feeling quite strongly about the topic. So I think it'd be great to hear from him, and also Festus when we have a moment.
So I'll just kind of lay the foundation so Festus can dunk the ball. So in terms of virtual accounts, when you mentioned that they are untraceable, I frowned a bit because that's not true. Right? That's absolutely not true. I think that's the industry belief, but everything is traceable. I don't want to start going into the details in terms of the architecture, right? But virtual accounts typically are hosted by banks, right? And then we kind of, in a kind of, I don't want to call it correspondent or respondent, but really that's what it is. We have like a relationship with the fintechs, and then we provide that infrastructure to them to extend it to customers. Ultimately, they are accounts, right? I probably don't want to go against what the CBN has told you, but I know that we have been in a lot of closed-door discussions with them, and we have made it very clear to them that it's not anything alien. So if you understand the no-ban account, no-ban is the accounts that everybody uses. It's the same thing. The only difference here is that we issue these accounts to third parties, that's one. 2, the accounts do not follow the no-ban algorithm. So every bank, again, I'm going too technical, but the point is they are accounts, right? They are accounts. There are 2 types of those accounts. There is a static virtual account, there's a dynamic virtual account. They all have different use cases. They all have audit trails. The problem here is that they are being abused. They are not being used the way they were supposed to be used. So ideally, some of those accounts are just supposed to be temporary stopgaps, and then they flow into settlement accounts. Because the people who issue these accounts, like I said, payment service companies and all that, are not supposed to hold accounts for customers. They are, if you have an account with a bank, then the account is in your name, right? But you can't have an account with a PSP because the PSP is not supposed to hold accounts for anybody. So typically, what they are supposed to do is the money is supposed to touch that virtual account and then go into a settlement account. From the settlement account, it goes into the customer's account in a bank where you can hold money. Long and short of what I'm saying is that the reason why it seems like money is disappearing is because those things are not being properly used. That's one. 2, there's also the hidden layer of crypto. Right? So when some of these things happen, why you think the money is disappearing is because the money has been converted into virtual assets and it has left the fiat ecosystem. So you can't see it because the crypto ecosystem does not have a connected audit trail to the fiat ecosystem. Again, the point of it is, I think by the time the regulators have technical discussions with the players, these things are very, very clear. Whether we'll then put in place regulations to guide them is another discussion. But I do know that we have been in one-on-one discussions with the CBN, and I was part of that. We explained what it was to them. And a lot of financial institutions have processes in place to manage these things, right? For example, my financial institution, we provide banking as a service. And we have clear guidelines, even though they are not backed by regulations, because there are no regulations. But we have clear guidelines around how we provide that service. So I don't think it's a risky business. I think it's just being abused. And once regulation comes in, structured control comes in, it's a wonderful innovation, believe me, wonderful innovation.
Well, yeah, I'd just like to thank all of the panel for their excellent input, really interesting conversation. Thank you also to the audience for questions and so on. And yeah, I'd say that's it for the panel.
Okay, thank you very
so
much.
guys.
Please, can you put your hands together for them? Please, let me have you guys come up for a group picture. And then I would like to invite Intakisha to please come up to help me present this gift to our panelists after they take the picture.